This is a summary of Act 2 of the Duchess of Malfi. Act 2 continues the division of two sides and creates the dramatic conflict that the play needs. So we establish Ferdinand and Cardinal and the Duchess and Antonio on two sides. We'll be looking at imagery, recurring motifs, and how the act develops. The scene starts with Bosola having an exchange with Castruccio. You might think about the symbolism of Castruccio's name and how that relates to symbolism of names in Merchant's Tale. We've got an encounter. I think they talk about ambition, which is a recurring theme in the play, particularly with Antonio and Bosola later in the act. But essentially, Bosola uses his wit to sort of put down Castruccio. He then puts down an old lady. Again, you might talk about the representation of women in this play. We've got the old lady, Julia, Carriola, and of course the Duchess, and women in general. But essentially, he insults her physical appearance. I'll talk a bit about that afterwards. Okay. Antonio and Delio get together. They're both good friends, and we've gone nine months further on. The Duchess is pregnant. Bosola offers her apricots. You might think about the use of fruit in both texts. The Duchess goes into labour. Antonio is left alone and is worried about what will happen if the pregnancy is revealed. These are some of the quotes that Bosola uses against women, and particularly about women in general, and also about the old woman. You might notice the illness and disease imagery that he uses, which occurs throughout the play. I do wonder you do not loathe yourself is something that could apply to Bosola himself. You could argue that his use of disease imagery perhaps suggests how he feels diseased in himself and how he views the world as a diseased place. You might also look at the quotes that refer to women as like associated with the devil, and compare that with how women are seen in the Merchant's Tale. This is a speech from Bosola. The woman is still there, so it's a monologue. In some editions, it's seen as a soliloquy. He's alone. Bosola is really interesting because he comments not only on how he sees the world as a very depraved place, he's kind of commenting on himself as well. As the malcontent, that's his role in the play. He's an observer of human nature, and he's able to observe human nature in himself, which sets him apart from, say, January or Ferdinand. And so there's lots of echoes of Shakespeare in this speech as well. Perhaps what thing is this, an outward form of man, to be loved, beloved, kind of reminds us of Hamlet's speeches. There's also lots of references to man's deformity, the theme of appearance versus reality, where Bosola says man stands amazed to see his deformity in other creatures but himself. He's willing to see his own deformity and comments on how others deceive themselves. There's lots of references to death and how we try to hide from the very things we fear. A rotten and dead body we delight to hide in rich tissues. So again, it's interesting that the theme of appearance and reality versus reality goes with Bosola, who appears to be something he is not. And yet he's the most honest character in the play because he doesn't deceive himself, arguably. You could argue against that too, but we will later on. This is Act 2, Scene 2. This is an interesting exchange between Bosola and Antonio. In this play, the good characters are forced to deceive, and so we've got the malcontent claiming, "Let me be simply honest," and Antonio saying, "I do understand your inside," but Bosola says, "Do you really?" And so there's lots of references here to ambition. Antonio accuses Bosola of just pretending to appear to the world puffed up, but melancholy, because he's trying to hide his ambition. And Bosola says, "I confess to you, sir, I look no higher than I can reach." Now, in many ways, his words can be taken in two ways. He's saying, I don't have any ambition, I just am quite happy where I am. Or, because he's a malcontent, he's an outlier, he can reach further than perhaps people expect him to. And so he's revealing himself honestly. So the theme of revealing yourself honestly through deception runs through both of these two characters. In many ways, they're very similar. Antonio has risen above his own ranks to be seen as the chief man of the Duchess. Sir, you are the lord of the ascendant, says Bosola. Antonio has done what Bosola wants to do. He wants to rise above his fixed place in the world. Antonio does so. And Antonio also sees in Bosola perhaps the devil, the enemy that he is. He's starting to realise that Bosola is out to get him. Okay, let's talk a little bit about dramatic irony. Because the play is a tragedy, everyone going to the theatre knows it's a tragedy, and they know how it's going to end. It's the tragical history of the Duchess of Malfi. I believe that's what it's called. So the title is rooted in tragedy, therefore the audience know what's going to happen. There's dramatic irony as a result. So there we see. The tragedy of the Duchess of Malfi is the title. So there is dramatic irony. And we see that continuously through asides. In this scene, Bosola has given the Duchess apricots. How greedily she eats them. Nay, you are too much swelled already. He's on the case, he knows she's already pregnant. The fruit, obviously, is revealing of desire, and you can talk about the obvious connections with the pear tree in Chaucer, and the reference obviously to the Garden of Eden, and the idea of temptation, forbidden fruit, desire, transgression. Okay, so in the world of the Duchess of Malfi, even the honest must deceive to hide their truth, which is an interesting theme that that runs through the play, the appearance versus reality. So Antonio starts to mimic the language of Bosola. He uses asides. This mole does undermine me. He has to lie, pretend there's been a robbery, so that he confines everyone to their quarters, so that no one can hear the Duchess in childbirth. And then there's an exchange in which Bosola is outside and Antonio is outside. They both distrust each other. Antonio's quote, "I'll pull you up by the roots, impotent snake." He compares him to, or uses the metaphor of a weed. And perhaps you can talk about plants and trees, evergreen trees, how January compares himself, or indeed to the tree, again, in the Merchant's Tale. Impudent snake and false steward reminds us perhaps of how Damien is compared as the perilous serpent in the garden in the Merchant's Tale. You should always look at the end of scenes. They often end on a rhyming couplet. Let's take Antonio's rhyming couplet here. Great like the bass, no, they're the same when they seek shameful ways to avoid shame. So this honest character ends the scene with a couplet in which he's describing his own actions and how he's had to descend into lies and how he sees this as shameful. And again, Bosola kind of mimics that language as well with his rhyming couplet at the end of the act. Though lust do mask in never so strange disguise, she's oft found witty but never wise. He's commenting there on how people put on appearances, they wear a mask. And it might be intelligent, but it might be witty, but it's not wise. Okay, the mask will drop, you will be found out as the deception in the Merchant's Tale has to be revealed. That could be a comparison you could make. But here, Antonio and Bosola are kind of two sides of the same coin. Okay, this scene with the Cardinal with Julia establishes the Cardinal's pure gangster credentials. We found out before that he's embezzled, he's gambled, he's got men killed, he's corrupt, he's having an affair with another man's wife. And in this scene, what he tends to talk about is the inconstancy of women, with the quotes illustrated here. A reference to the context of the time, Galileo's invention of the telescope, and how difficult it is to find a constant woman, which is something you can compare with Theophrast, the merchant, Seneca, and all the misogynistic auctorities of the merchant, as well as Pluto in the tale itself, as well as Justinus as well. So there's a nice comparison with what the cardinal thinks of women and the other tales as well. The cardinal goes on to compare Julia to an animal, a bird of prey, which he fed on his wrist. Again, the comparison of women like animals is something that you might explore in both texts. There's a lot of sexual innuendo in this speech. He's reminding her of how her husband was merely a tame elephant looking at her, who didn't give her what she wanted. And it was like somebody playing on a lute that they couldn't really play. The inference is that the cardinal knows how to play a tune, and she should thank him for it. One of the most popular questions in the exam is that, how do your writers present women? And Julia isn't all she seems. Yes, she's an adulteress and she's cheating on her husband. But we see that she genuinely seems to have loved the cardinal. The cardinal seems to have played her with courtly love, piteous wounds of the heart and sick liver, love sickness. And that's what wooed her. So the suggestion is that she fell for him out of love rather than mere lust. And the interesting thing about the exchange with Delio, who's supposedly one of the good characters, the friend of Antonio, is that she can't be bought for money. There's a loyalty there, even though she's presented as disloyal by the cardinal. And Delio finishes, is this her wit or honesty that speaks thus? You know, we're left to question what we think of Julia. And Webster perhaps shows us that, you know, there's more grey areas to this woman than there are black and white, good or bad. She refuses to be bought. That's the most important thing, I suppose, from this scene. So she does have personal integrity. So to Ferdinand and the Cardinal, the letter that Bosola sends arrives, and it reveals that the Duchess has had a child. And the reaction to the letter, and you could compare the use of letters in both texts. Remember that Damien sends May a letter proposing his love, and she puts it down the bin. This letter, she puts it down the privy. This letter reveals the madness of Ferdinand. Look at his language and his quotes, how he says, I'm grown mad. His language is full of infection and disease because revenge is creating disease within him. And again, like his brother, he comments on the inconstancy of women and compares them to animals. Excellent hyena being one example that you can compare. The end of acts in drama are rather like the ends of episodes of EastEnders. They have to end on a kind of heightened climax. And from here, we have the strange fantasy climaxing in the infected, corrosive desire for revenge of Ferdinand, who cannot stop himself but imagine his sister in the act of lovemaking with the well-known quote, strong-thighed bargemen and lovely squires. Lovely squires reminds us of Damien, of course. And again, his language is violent, passionate, diseased. Again, about seeing her, whore's milk shall quench my wildfire, but whore's blood, this desire for revenge is something that is intrinsic to revenge tragedies. And I'll talk about that in Act 3 a little bit more in my next summary. But he decides at the end to only study to seem the thing he is not. The theme of appearance and reality that runs through all of this play, with, in a sense, all of the characters in different ways, can be explicitly summed up with that quote. So he decides to be the thing that he's not, but then he cannot stop himself from thinking about his sister in bed, and he imagines them in sheets that he would pour pitch or sulphur. Sulphur, again, is associated with the devil, and he wants to burn them. So he's kind of whipping himself with his own perverse desires. His tempestuous nature is its own punishment. And I suppose that quote about scorpions and whips might remind readers of Macbeth, full of scorpions is my mind. He's deciding at the end in that rhyming couplet of whips and eclipse that he's going to kill her. He's going to fix her in a general eclipse. He's going to focus on her, and he's going to continue to punish himself in order to do that. Of course, the cardinal reacts in a completely different way, and even asks him if he's stark, staring mad, and asks him to put himself in tune. Again, he continues the metaphor that he had with Julia in the previous scene. So we end on the division of two sides and a clear sense of this is going to end in tragedy and murder and revenge. And so it heightens the anticipation of the audience for what's going to happen in the next act. I've taken this slide from Mr. Dore's PowerPoint because I think it's quite interesting what he's found about Francis Bacon, another writer and philosopher from the 17th century. He comments on revenge here. You can read that rather than me having to read it to you. But revenge is at the heart of all tragedies in many ways, particularly in Shakespeare. We see it in Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, we see it in Romeo and Juliet, we see it in King Lear. And the moral message from revenge, or from revenge tragedies, a particularly Christian message perhaps, is that the person who goes out seeking revenge should dig two graves. You know, if you set out to poison someone, you should drink the poison yourself first. And the message is that revenge is morally corrosive. As soon as someone sets off on revenge, that they are distorted and corrupted by that revenge. And we see that through the language of Ferdinand, his obsessions, his perverse and turbulent nature, as the description of him in Act 1 is coming true. His perverse obsessions with his sister and his turbulent nature showing itself in diseased imagery, becoming much more violent and bloody. And so this foreshadows perhaps the tragedy that comes later on in the play. So if you get a question on, are these texts moral, you perhaps need to think about tragedies in which immoral things happen, but there is a kind of moral universe at play with a moral message that ultimately revenge will corrupt the revenger. And that's the end of this summary for Act 2.